Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. Chapter 2 of Part 1, The Riddle of the Earth's Shape. That night, Alexander went quickly away from Pella, riding headlong down the road, being careful to avoid the gardens. What hurt he felt at the disappearance of the strange girl he had known for the beginning of a night, he concealed. He withdrew into one of his moody silences, working through much of the night at a plan of the star constellations, because he found it hard to sleep. Then Olympias demonstrated that she was shrewd, but not wise, thinking only of herself. She had a way of seeing upon instinct. Now something like fear disturbed her. Deeply superstitious, she wondered if the strange appearance of the barbarian girl had not been in reality an omen intended for her. If so, what did the sending portend? Olympias worried about that, and also about Alexander. She felt that he was no longer obedient to her will. Mother stage, father stage, child stage, adolescence. It kind of happens eventually. Doesn't mean that he was rebelling just to rebel. There was good reason for him to rebel against both his parents, wasn't there? Something had changed him, setting him apart from her. At that time, Olympias had no hatred for Philip. She could not endure him because he seemed to be indifferent to her, only speaking to her when they met after absence, when he saluted her in his clown-like fashion as queen mother, not as his proper wife. Olympias hardly knew the meaning of fear. Now undecided and having no one to confide in, she sent for Aristander of Telemes, the diviner, who could not be bribed like the Greeks. Olympias understood very well that it would take more than money to enlist Aristander in her service. To him she poured out her troubles. The soothsayer took his time about answering her. The stars, in their courses, he muttered absently, arbitrate human fate. What were the omens at the birth of your son? Olympias moved impatiently. Aristander remembered as well as she how the temple at Ephesus in Asia had burned that same night. Still wrapped in thought, Aristander murmured that since then 2 things had been made clear. Certainly she had no other child, and plainly Alexander was peculiar. The omen, he continued, was one of fire. It descended from the heavens. And does not Philip now call you queen mother? There's always mythological themes, no matter how you draw the constellations and stuff, that can be played with by a soothsayer, right? And they got to be careful lest they be killed for their predictions, right? Drawing the dark hair like a veil across her mouth, Olympias studied him. Pride stabbed at her like a goad, and a fire did descend from the sky that night. And if Philip were not the boy's father, that, declared Aristander, is something you would know best. When it came to a question of exalting herself, Olympias never hesitated. Moreover, Aristander had no more than hinted at what was already in her thoughts. Before the diviner left, her priestess at Samothrace had made up her mind. Only gradually and by the older servants was it spoken about the palace, and only then during Philip's absence. It was no more than rumor rising out of the omens at first, whispered in the women's quarters, that Alexander might not be Philip's son, that an unknown had impregnated the priestess that night, when a snake had been seen coming from the marriage bed. Some of the servants pointed out that Philip had seen the snake and had become blind in one eye soon thereafter. Arsinoe, perhaps, who had belonged to Philip before his marriage, heard the the gossip with dread. Now happily installed as mistress of Lagus's house, she understood the wayward Philip and the explosive Olympias better than they knew each other. In her fright, Ariso, uh, Arsinoe sent word to Mysa, to Ptolemy. Her son's future was bound up with Philip's whims, and the astute Ptolemy found food for thought in the message. Now, in Greek, you don't pronounce the upsilon as E or I, so, I'm trying to give a Greek pronunciation without them giving me Greek characters to work with. What? And the stupid found food. Okay, instead of trying to find out what the morning stars are singing, he warned Alexander, you better lend an ear to what is said in the marketplace. Apella. What? Alexander demanded, surprised. Nobody can tell you what. You have to hear things with your own ears and see them with your eyes, personally, before you believe anything. If the vault of the sky were cracking open, you'd go on pouring over map projections until all came down on your head. That's a chart of the constellations one can't quite see. The last thing Alexander cared to do at the time was to visit the market where the peasants' wives cackled over their onions and lentils. If he had not kept himself buried in his cell with his drawings and notes, he might have been aware of the talk in Macedon, and he might have avoided both humiliation and exile. But it seems certain that in those years he never freed his mind from study. He had labored through the elementary work, and now he was mastering both politics and cosmography. Now he kept notebooks of his own and raced through all the manuscripts Aristotle would lend him. From this labor in his cell he broke off only to sacrifice and to walk through the hills in the night hours. Although still at odds with Aristotle, he had ceased to rebel at the teaching and was even on the track of a discovery of his own. Alexander had discovered, to his own satisfaction, the blank space, the unknown terrain of the East. There had been in his imagination the place of the sun's rising. Now he was learning that there might actually exist unvisited lands at the far end of the terrestrial globe, bordering upon ocean. The Stagirite and his assistant philosophers no longer wasted thought on the early Milesian concept of the cosmos, that of primeval night extending through a void, except where the points of light of the sun and moon illuminated the earth, and the planets revolved around it upon their orbits harmoniously, creating the music of the spheres. By now the philosophers had arrived at another concept. The earth they thought to be a sphere hung immovably in the center of the universe. Aristotle believed this to be proved by the fact that during an eclipse the earth cast a round shadow against either sun or moon, and explorers had testified that in the far north the southernmost constellations of stars were no longer visible. The Babylonians talked about the three levels of perception of the stars. So they knew the world was a globe. About this terrestrial globe revolved the sun and moon, alternating light and darkness on the halves of the globe. Upon this globe, land had arisen from the waters throughout the millenniums, and this landmass was still extending, still rising, in spite of the corrosive action of the moving waters, but only a portion of this land remained habitable to man. This habitable portion, called Oikumene stretched perceptibly farther along the course of the sun from east to west in its longitude than in breadth from north to south at its latitude. Above the Oikumene lay the region of Hyperborean cold, a perpetual snow and drifting ice. Aristotle had talked with the Cimmerians, inhabitants of what is now Russia, who had ascended frozen rivers to the edge of this polar region. They were hunters, and they reported that there, at the borderland of the habitable zone, many animals had white pelts, evidence of existence in snow countries. Below the Oikumene extended, of course, the belt of tropical heat where human beings could not survive, and the land tended to become sand, burned by the sun's concentrated heat. Due south of Pella lay the fertile Libyan coast, whereas travelers who had penetrated inland report that they had been surrounded by illimitable deserts, hostile to man. In those deserts, only thornbush grew in the north, and poisonous vipers crawled upon it, while water dug from the ground had been salty and undrinkable. Evidently, at this southern frontier of the Oikumene existed forces that destroyed human life in the same manner as the bleak cold, the frost-bitten earth, the devastating winds, the great white monsters of the Hyperborean north sapped the life of men. Certainly, it seemed apparent that the north-south limits of the Oikumene lay at no great distance apart and had already been reached by the adventurous men such as the Argonauts, the crew of the ship Argos. Now, aside from the mythologization of a couple constellations or a constellation, depending on which exact cultural inflection you're going to look at and which stars that vary too. Let's not pretend that all these constellations, the 88 ones that we typically have names for, are just, that we typically, that's, it's all the same number of stars, whichever, even Greek versus Greek, right? But before the Great Flood at the end of the last ice age, I don't mean some flood covering the entire earth. I mean the coastal floods and that sort of thing with the melting of the ice. After some of what went on during that period is mythologized in tales like this, or preserved, you might say. Aristotle, however, raised a question about these limits of latitude. He asked who had been known to visit the sources of the greatest rivers. Such rivers, if the theory of global circulation of waters was correct, must take their rise in distant mountains, where a myriad streams formed the watercourses, where then lay the source of the mighty Nile that appeared in full girth within the otherwise dry valley land of Egypt, and where were the headwaters of the Danube, almost as huge as the Nile, that flowed through the forests north of Macedon, down to the far Euxine Sea, the modern Black Sea. Animal and plant life must exist, Aristotle argued, along such water sources, and if so, men could survive there. Yet no Greeks had penetrated the sources of the Nile or Danube. And that, to a degree, was the problem with the Romans, and even nowadays with our ancient alien theories and stuff like this. It's like, oh, if we haven't done it, then no, these ancient people or these other people of other cultures, they haven't done it. And if we can't be happy, and it turns out that a sense of well-being is more common in poor countries than first world countries because people realize what they need, what they don't need, that sort of thing. And Alexander had his mind fixed on the far eastern limit of Oikumene. The western limit, whither the sun vanished, offered no attraction. In the Mesa laboratory, he could study notes of the voyages of those rival traders, Phoenicians and merchants of Carthage, who had seen and even passed through the western water gate of the interior Mediterranean Sea, between rocky heights called the Pillars of Heracles, or the mountain of the great Atlas. Water flowed out from the Mediterranean to the encircling ocean. In that strait of water, herds of strange dolphins had been encountered that played around the galleys. Beyond the thresh of oars, farther out, stretched the dark surface of the ocean itself, subjected to the buffeting of the winged sons of the north wind and the screaming furies who were emissaries of Zeus, the one who they called the Godfather. But remember, there's some reference in the so-called New Testament of how they don't mean the father thing literally. Don't call your earthly father your father. So they're probably replacing a word of what was actually said, right? I mean, in the biblical sense, but people understood the father, mother, child metaphor to a degree. Thus, in the West, the limit of human advance was fixed not only by the impassable ocean, but by the hostile leviathans of the deep salt waters, which could crush sailing galleys as easily as a man could break apart a wasp nest. So said the venturesome mariners. Even Aristotle had slight interest in the far western latitudes. He did not believe, as Plato had, that upon this Atlantic portion of outer ocean extended islands, known in legends as the Blessed Isles, or sometimes as the lost island of Atlantis. He did not believe it, for the simple reason that he had come across no evidence of it, nor would he waste thought upon a lost Atlantic civilization, pointing out that civilization seemed to have advanced from east to west, not the other way around. At least, the sciences had been known in Asia before they were known in Crete, and apparently the Greeks learned from Asia also, especially from Egypt. Now, the Egyptians say southwest, and there's genetic and other evidence that points it to Atlantis. But what really happened was this port dried out. And, the eye of the Sahara. Sahara is a desert. So the thing became a desert, and the culture, shifted the Dogon and into the Egyptians. They passed some other thing, but it could be a trans-African, sort of American even sized culture back in the day. But Atlantis wasn't some sunken sea kingdom. Lemuria too was not, the story's exaggerated and it's not quite what we're talking about. People say, Atlantis, no, not Atlantis. It's like, Herodotus told us where it was, but they kind of turned it into something else. This only set Alexander more firmly on the path of his discovery, but now he felt certain, and Aristotle did not deny it, that the eastern limits of the Oikumene were not known at all. Truly the Iliad mentioned the threshold of Asia, the water gate of the Dardanelles, where Troy stood. Troy had been there without a doubt, yet the Argonauts had passed beyond along the chain of the waterways, through the Dardanelles, into the far Euxine. Somewhere around the Euxine, factual knowledge ended and myth began. Well, myth is, meaning and purpose. Not quite the same as not a fact. But myth, if it's not true, sometimes represents truth. Sometimes these voyagers, the Argonauts, had actually been searching for gold washed down from the mountains instead of the legendary gold fleece. Well, the gold fleece was actually their method of sifting for gold, and it's a very effective method that's still actually used today. They actually use wool filters in Afghanistan. Some people do. There's other places too, but Still they ventured into the mythical mountains at the end of the farthest sea, those mounts of Caucasus, where the Titan Prometheus had been bound, his giant shape rearing within reach of the predatory birds of the upper air. Present-day voyagers to the Greek colonies in the Euxine, reported seeing the loom. Again, I don't have Greek characters. The loom of vast mountains rising in the cloud level, where their summits were covered by everlasting snow. Through this mountain barrier of the Caucasus, the mariners said a gate gave access to the unknown farther east. Yonder, some Asiatics believed, lay the inland sea called the Caspian, frequented by giant bird life, by Amazons, and by unknown celestial powers. Well, of course, men would put their fantasy women just. Oh, well, you can't reach the fantasy women that I've encountered. Okay. This Caspian, if it truly existed, might flow northward to the outer ocean. By ancient reckoning or surmise, Greece, and therefrom Macedon, lay almost in the center of the Oikumene. From Athens, for example, it seemed to be about as far to the water gate of Heracles in the west as to the land gate through the Caucasus in the east. But Alexander wanted rather to believe that the venturesome thinkers who placed the center of the habitable world much farther to the east, in this unknown area of the east, Alexander believed that the entities that they considered to be gods, but the true beings, rather than just projections, one might think, might still exist. Patiently, he gathered together all the threads of evidence he could find, reading through legends and stories of Eastern voyagers in the steady hours of the night, while Aristotle buried himself in the laboratory experiments. He no longer pored over Homer before blowing out the lamps. Still, he did not confide much either in his companions or in the scientists. Now, one of the things that you definitely see Western, even in amongst the polytheists, that's it occurs in the East, but it's very common. It's more common in the West. This idea of God being separate from us, and it certainly helps with the rebellious. God is a deist sort of attitude of maybe there is a God, but the God's not not here to involve itself, which leads to behavioral issues and whatnot. But by following the tract of his idea, as if tracing a way through a Cretan labyrinth, he made certain of some points in the histories of Herodotus. Facts gave way to fables about as far east as the Caucasus, the Caucasus. So many of these things I should look up of it, but there's actually footnotes in some of this, but they're okay. The farthest great city to be fully described by this Herodotus was Babylon, whose lofty terraced gardens and skyscraping towers were a wonder of the habitable world. Yet one Phoenician related that the name Babylon actually meant Bab-il, the gate of God. Babarouche. Yeah, that's what it means. Alexander knew nothing about the Phoenician language, but he caught. The Phoenician language was a different thing, anyways. But he caught at the mention of a gateway. For Babylon lay, it seemed, about the same longitude as the Caucasus mountain barrier, which had also a gateway opening to the east. What lay beyond? Now, let's remember, at this time, nobody was calling it Hebrew, and Judaism by name was not known, and there's still not any mention going that far back of Judaism by name. Then following out Aristotle's method of tracing land shapes by the course and size of rivers, Alexander satisfied himself that the two such rivers flowed by Babylon, the twin Tigris and Euphrates. In what area, then, did they have their source? In the heights of the Caucasus. In the heights of the Caucasus. In the heights of the Caucasus. The Caucasus. Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever. I keep messing that up. Sorry. Are in unknown heights farther east. These twin rivers emptied without doubt into the south, into the stream of the outer ocean. But where did they take their rise? What if the greatest mass of mountains lay beyond the known limits, rising farther above the earth's atmosphere into the heavenly ether? What if the twin Tigris and Euphrates flowed out of this immense height, beyond which the sun rose out of ocean itself? What if this elevation, far above earth's surface, were the abode of the powers? Would their men called it Parnassus or Olympus or Paradise, as the Asiatics did? Most legends, he discovered, originated in the far distant east. There, men said, the very waters of life flowed out of the ground, the waters that preserved life forever in those who drank them. There, too, was situated, by all accounts, the tree of life, the fruit of which imparted celestial knowledge to humans. Now, actually, there's a tree of life constellation, too, so... So was there something that they projected a constellation, or did they form a constellation and then project a worldly version? Surely the traces of these so-called gods all led towards this unknown side of the earth. The older shrines stood towards the point of the sun's rising. In every case, this was true. Delphi, down in Greece, was younger than Aradus on Asia's shore. Apollo's temple in Athens had been built long after the sanctuary of Zeus, Ammon, in Egypt, and that in turn had not existed, so Alexander conceived, when the Chaldeans and the Magians of Babylon first worshipped their sun god. Now the Magians, they don't worship the fire, they don't worship the sun. This was not part of Persian culture, but although there are outside of the Mazdaeanian Zarathustrian area of at least some alliance, you do have people worshiping angels and whatnot of these various. Well, okay, you do have that in the when polytheism slipped back into that, but they worshipped beings of the forces of nature, perhaps, but they didn't worship the forces of nature and the objects of nature themselves. So that set them apart. Very soon, Alexander discovered that Mysa possessed a drawing of the image of the world by Hecataeus that actually set in place the lands and rivers and seas as if the oikumene were visible in its entirety, seen from a vast height. Oh, there's some very interesting maps that even show coast of Antarctica millions of years ago as it would be without ice and other things that, the very earliest of humans, I guess, somehow passed on their information. But the true Kanon Zardosht, they don't worship the entities of these things. They only worship God. But just like a lot of things, people have taken on the title. They face directions in prayer. That doesn't mean they worship the sun or the moon or the fire. So confusion arises. This he copied painstakingly, adding to it his notes upon the shrines, the routes of the legendary voyagers, and the gates opening into the goal of his imagination, the unknown East. Unfortunately, he could not resist tracing along the eastern border a vast height that dwarfed all other mountain ranges. Upon this he wrote a name, Parapanisades, the greatest wall, as being the only proper name for the homeland of these entities. Inevitably, other eyes saw his world picture, and whispers about the Parapanisades began to be heard in the halls of Mysa. Harpalas, who followed the prevailing fashions, posed on the roof, looking through the tubular height finder zealously explaining that he had dreamed that the summit of the mightiest wall, that pent in so-called gods and demons, had appeared to his sight above the clouds. Some of the assistants argued with Alexander about the folly of sketching distances on a chart until the distances were paced off by surveyors on foot. In stadia are steps. Only the sea-coast, they said, could be sketched in, since they were fairly well determined by the transits of ships, which, driven by the winds, sailed at a uniform speed. Then Parapanisades talk. The Parapanisades talk must have reached Aristotle's ears. Instead of arguing directly with his rebellious pupil, he contented himself with pointing out one evening in the garden that the frontier of knowledge was being pushed back steadily, so that more of the habitable world was known with the passing of each century, and, in his dry, lisping voice, he added that, in the time before Homer, Mount Olympus, which they could all see from the southern Macedon, had been thought to be the home of the gods.